1921 to 1928. The tangled political arguments of the 1920s are important here only in so far as they help to clarify the picture of Muhammad Ali Jinnah. The question is, how was he influenced by these arguments? What part did he enact in the interplay between Gandhi and the other leaders, who seem more in love with the conflict than with any solution that might be bred of it? Dr. Annie Besant's view was that Gandhi believed in suffering and that he was not happy if he achieved his object through normal evolutionary methods. In this also, Jinnah was his opposite, for he was devoted to normal evolutionary methods and he remained so to the end. There are records of these years, 1921 to 28, in many books published in India, but they are prejudiced and seldom detached. There are no diaries and few letters from which to trace the progress of Jinnah's mind, no painted portrait into which one might search for the look on his face. It is therefore difficult to keep the light on him during these years of lull between the resignation from the Imperial Legislative Council, the Home Rule League and Congress, and his ultimate decision in 1931 to settle in England and abandon Indian politics forever. These were the years of his brief marriage, of which he was always reluctant to speak. His only child, Dina Jinnah, was born on 15 August 1919. For Jinnah, married life was a solemn duty. For his young wife, it was also an opportunity for pleasure. Jinnah had been a recluse for many years, coming home from the law courts or his political meetings to his staid bachelor habits. Now he had to adapt himself to a social life that was too merry for his nature. There were holidays in London, where the student who had trudged from Lincoln's Inn to one gas-lit room on the drab edge of Kensington now had to endure the frivolities of the Berkeley and the Savoy. Jinnah learned to reconcile these holidays and excitements with his work as a brilliant advocate, receiving the highest fees paid in India. In politics, he had retired to a second place from which he watched Mahatma Gandhi's overwhelming success, achieved by ways that Jinnah despised. He said to a rival politician in later years, "You try to find out what will please people and you then act accordingly. My way of action is quite different. I first decide what is right and I do it. The people come around me and the opposition vanishes." He continued to believe this true, but during these years, he had to watch another star enjoying the heavens. On the sixth anniversary of Gopal Krishna Gokale's death, Jinnah spoke in memory of his friend. "It is a pity there are so few men like him to be with us in such a critical time as the present." He was convinced in his mind that Gandhi's program was taking the people into a wrong channel. Gandhi had talked of withdrawing boys from government aided schools and sending them into the villages to teach the illiterate. He had even tried to induce the students to leave Aligarh, still the chief stronghold of young Muslim scholarship. Jinnah answered these extravagant ideas with a practical argument that if Gandhi boycotted the schools founded on the British pattern, he must then build national schools in their place. Of Gandhi's campaign of non-cooperation and boycott of British goods, Jinnah asked how many of the 20,000 delegates at the National Congress had really boycotted foreign goods up to now. He would accept their principle only when they built their own mills and competed with the foreigners like men. Always, he dragged Gandhi's dreams back to earth and reality. The Government of India Act of 1919 had introduced many concessions to the Indian people, and in January 1921, the Duke of Connaught arrived to inaugurate the new constitution. In the king's name, a greater degree of responsibility had been given to the Indians in almost every department of local government. The details of these reforms are explained in many political histories of this period. A glance at them shows that in the legislature of the major provinces, while such departments as finance, land revenue, and police were reserved to the governor and his executive council, the care of education, public health, etc., was transferred to Indian ministers, chosen from the elected leaders of the provincial legislatures. Thus, by a system of diarchy or dual government, the British were trying to keep the internal security in their hands, whilst giving the Indians the opportunity to care for their own social and nation building services. The change that might have affected Jinnah was the abolition of the old Imperial Legislative Council and the introduction of a two house parliamentary system, with a Council of State and a Central Legislative Assembly. In both houses, the elected members formed the majority. The first polls under the new constitutions had been held in November 1920, but Jinnah had not sought election. In April 1921, Lord Reading succeeded Lord Chelmsford as Viceroy. On 17 November, the Prince of Wales arrived in Bombay. He said, I want you to know me and I want you to know you. I want to grasp your difficulties and to understand your aspirations. Then, I feel some awe at the difficulty which I may experience in getting to know India. In another part of Bombay, at Gandhi's behest, there was a public burning of foreign clothes as a protest against the prince's visit. Jinnah's social life at this time was mostly with his wife's Parsi friends. It is therefore interesting to read in the confidential report written by the political secretary to the government of India after the prince had departed in Bombay. Perhaps the principal political result of the visit has been indirectly to strengthen the traditional loyalty of the Parsi community. The general effect has been that the great bulk of the Parsi community and all their responsible leaders have definitely recognized that their interest as a community lies in opposition to the forces of disorder and non cooperation. Jinnah no doubt shared this belief, that his interests also lay in opposition to the forces of disorder and non cooperation. Meanwhile, the Mahatma's mass awakening, as he called it, led to lust for plunder and rapine, and as a measure against further disaster, he was arrested for sedition and sent to prison. Jinnah still waited patiently. He took little part in political affairs until November 1923 when he was elected to the Central Legislative Assembly unopposed by the Muslims of Bombay. His plea before the elections was moderate. He said, I have no desire to seek any post or position or title from the government. My sole object is to serve the cause of the country as best as I can. His faith in Hindu Muslim unity did not weaken. In spite of the terrible evidence that the differences between the two communities were so deep rooted that no politician could ever hope to dispel them. In May 1924, 3 months after Gandhi had been released from prison, Jinnah again stated his enduring belief at a meeting of the Muslim League in Lahore. He said, the advent of foreign rule and its continuance in India is primarily due to the fact that the people of India, particularly the Hindus and Muslims, are not united and do not sufficiently trust each other. I am almost inclined to say that India will get dominion responsible government the day the Hindus and Muslims are united. But these conciliatory words became lost in the widening rift between the two communities. Jinnah pleaded for adequate representation of the Muslims and of other minorities in all the legislatures of the country. He called on the Hindus to realize that unless Muslims were guaranteed separate electorates with a fixed number of seats in the legislatures, his people would be in constant fear of being dominated and outvoted in every province where they were in a minority. But the promises made by Congress in the Lucknow Pact in 1916 were ignored and never kept. Jinnah later recalled that from 1925 onwards, many efforts were made for the adjustment of Hindu Muslim differences. He said, every time we were the petitioners, the supplicants standing at the doors of Mr. Gandhi and the Congress with our proposals formulated. He added, for some reason or the other, the reply was always no. In February 1925, Jinnah was appointed to the committee which was to advise on the Indianization of the army and the establishment of a military training college on the pattern of Sandhurst. This involved a journey to Europe and England One episode during the visits to Sandhurst proved that Jinnah was still overbearing in his manner. That experience was not bringing mellowness to his lively spirit. The officer chosen to organize the deputation at Sandhurst was Captain Gracie, now General Douglas Gracie, who has said, Jinnah's behavior with the officers who gave evidence before the deputation was so arrogant. It was as if he were dealing with hostile witnesses before a judge. I had to protest and point out that the officers were giving evidence voluntarily, with the object of helping him, and that they had a right to be treated with courtesy and consideration. General Sir Douglas Gracie added, Of course, he calmed down immediately. That was something I always liked about him in later years. Once he was challenged, he became reasonable, and he would never bear malice afterwards. The outcome of the deputation was the establishment of the military college at Dehradun, and for me, a touching insight into Jinnah's character. He might have remembered the episode at Sandhurst with bitterness, for I had up to him in no mean fashion. But no, when my name came up before him as Commander Chief of the Army in Pakistan, he accepted me and welcomed me with good grace. He remembered me quite we but never showed resentment. Jinnah returned to India with the deputation and continued his weakening campaign for unity. In November 1926, he was again elected to the Central Legislative Assembly. In March 1927 at Delhi, Jinnah and other Muslim leaders set down their proposals for representation in the various legislature in any future scheme of constitution. Their good faith towards the Hindus was shown by their willingness, should their proposals be accepted, to give to Hindu minorities in the predominantly Muslim provinces the same concessions that Hindu majorities in other provinces are prepared to make to Muslim minorities. In May, there was a glimmer of hope that Jinnah might have his way when the Committee of Congress agreed, in the main, to his proposals for Muslim representation. But these local affairs were overshadowed in November 1927 by the announcement that Sir John Simon and six other members of the British Parliament would proceed to India to review the progress made under the Constitution of 1919 and to advise on further reforms and measures of self-government. There was an immediate outcry, in which Jinnah joined, against the all-white membership of the Commission. Sir John Simon and his colleagues arrived in Bombay on 3 February 1928. 2 months later, Jinnah sailed for England alone. Early in 1928, Mrs. Jinnah had left the house in Mount Pleasant Road and had gone to live in the Taj Mahal Hotel. Husband and wife had come to a crisis in their relationship where the differences in their ages and their habits made harmony impossible. Once, after they parted, an old Parsi friend tried to reconcile them. Jinnah said to him, It is my fault. We both need some sort of understanding we cannot give. Mrs. Jinnah had already sailed for Europe with her parents. When her husband left Bombay in April 1928, his political career in dark confusion and his one experiment in private happiness apparently wrecked forever. One of Jinnah's companions on his voyage was his friend Diwan Chaman Lal, who wrote of him. Today he is unfortunately frankly disgusted. He said, The first problem to solve and settle is the problem of Hindu-Muslim unity. This is not a mere phrase, it is a concrete proposition. And suppose we did settle the problem. I say that then the united voice of the nation would be irresistible. Jinnah is frankly in a despondent mood. He is one of the few men who have no personal motives to nurse or personal aims to advance. His integrity is beyond question, and yet he is the loneliest of men. When they came to Suez, Diwan Chaman Lal induced Jinnah to go ashore. While the ship was creeping through the canal, Jinnah, in his immaculate clothes, mounted a camel. Diwan Chaman Lal mounted a donkey, and they went to see the Sphinx. Diwan Chaman Lal had observed Jinnah's political problems during the voyage. A few weeks later, he was to see past these concerns into his unfortunate heart. Soon after the ship arrived in England, Jinnah went to Ireland and Diwan Chaman Lal to Paris, where Mrs. Jinnah was also staying alone. Chaman Lal had been in his hotel only a few minutes when he learned that Mrs. Jinnah was in a hospital, dangerously ill. He has described the sad story of what had followed. I went to the hospital immediately. I had always admired Ruttie Jinnah so much. There is not a woman in the world today to hold a candle to her for beauty and charm. She was a lovely, spoiled child, and Jinnah was inherently incapable of understanding her. She was lying in bed, with a temperature of 106 degrees. She could barely move, but she held a book in her hand and she gave it to me. Read it to me, Cham, she said. I took the book. It was a volume of Oscar Wilde's poems, opened at the Harlow's house, she repeated in a whisper. Please read it to me, Cham. When I came to the closing lines, and down the long and silent street, the dawn with silver sandaled feet crept like a frightened girl. I looked up, Ruthie was in a coma. I hurried out and brought the doctor. A few days later, Jinnah arrived from Ireland. I waited in the hospital while he went in to see her. 2.5 hours he was with her. When he came out of her bedroom, he said, I think we can save her. We'll change the doctor and take her to another hospital. I am sure she will pull through. Ruthie Jinnah recovered and I left Paris soon afterwards for Canada, believing they were reconciled. Some weeks passed and I was in Paris again. I spent a day with Jinnah wondering why he was alone. In the evening, I said to him, Where is Ruthie? He answered, We quarrelled. She has gone back to Bombay. He said it with such finality that I dared not ask any more.